Welcome back to Engine Shop Joe, where you get information about Cummins engines and related engine systems. Tonight I wanted to talk about DEF fluid level and a little bit about DEF fluid usage. And the reason I wanted to talk about it is we do have a fair number of instances where operators will run systems completely out of DEF. And whether it's a crane or some other type of machine or a truck, whatever, if it's got a DEF tank, it has a DEF level gauge, and the ECM monitors that DEF. Now, generally speaking, on a Cummins system, you use about 2% DEF. So you could think of it like this. If you put 100 gallons of fuel in, you're going to use 2 gallons of DEF in the time you consume that 100 gallons of fuel. I've seen usage from 2 to 3%, okay? The reason it goes up to 3% is the system's efficiency, the NOx sensor's accuracy, because remember, DEF is supplied as to a feedback. So you have an inlet NOx sensor that measures the amount of NOx going into the exhaust system right out of the turbo. And then you have a second outlet NOx sensor that's measuring the amount of NOx that's coming out the muffler, I should say out the SCR brick, but into the muffler and then out into the atmosphere. And the difference between the inlet and the outlet is the amount of decrease that's been established in the nitrous oxides. And that's what the DEF system's about, is getting rid of nitrous oxide. So, and that causes acid rain, one of the things it causes. So anyway, if the NOx sensors if they drift, and by drift, they have a bias where your normal, they're calibrated to normal oxygen value in the air, and that can drift. And then when they're measuring, they measure incorrectly. The number they measure is drifted. So on the new engines, Cummins does have a test that you crank the engine, it doesn't start, and I think it cranks 30 seconds, and then it does a second. It does two 15-second cranks, and then it'll stop, and it does that to get clean air in the system. No fuel's injected, nothing. And so it's got just clean air coming in and going through the exhaust system, and then it does another crank, and there it measures the bias of the NOx sensors, and it'll fail them. So they're really trying to get that down to where they know that they're very accurate, because it affects the whole rest of the system. So once the NOx sensors are measuring NOx, everything's up to temperature, it becomes a feedback. So here's an example. It's not actual, it's not factual, but it is a good example of what happens. You have 100 parts per million of NOx going out of the turbo, and you have 75 coming out of the SCR brick, which would be too much. So the ECM sees the difference there, and it decides it needs to meter more DEF fluid in, because it looks at the temperatures, they're high enough in the after treatment, it should be working correctly. So it changes the duty cycle on the DEF injector, and it injects more DEF fluid, and then the NOx starts coming down, because the DEF fluid is there to, the ammonia does a chemical reaction with the NOx, breaks it down, and our numbers go down. So maybe we get down to 100 parts going in and 5 parts going out. And like I said, these are not real world truths, they're examples, but the premise of the example is accurate. So on a Cummins system, that to get that nitrous oxide where it needs to be coming out of the pipe, it takes about two gallons of DEF every 100 gallons of fuel. It can get as high as 3 gallons, so they say 2 to 3% is normal. I've seen it as high as 4. When it gets much over 4%, then you're going to start logging faults for inefficiency. It'll log faults on the DEF injector. If the pressure's okay, it'll log faults for SCR operator inducement, which just means the operator ran it a long time with it not working correctly, and he only knows that by fault lights and then D rates, right? So the system's just trying to make somebody say, stop, we need to check this out and fix whatever's wrong. And there's lots of reasons that those numbers can be off. Now, where do I find that 2, 3, and 4%? In Insight, there's a place called the trip information. And the trip information has 2 parts. It has the part that's permanent. And from the time you first turn the key and start that engine until the day it's worn out, 18,000 hours later, hopefully 18,000 on an X, every hour is accounted for and nothing's erased out of that trip information. And then there's a resettable part where you can go in and zero all the numbers. So that DEF percentage shows in both of those parts. So if you have a problem, and let's say, and remember that's a running average, by the way. So let's say you have a problem in a DEF system at 200 hours and they drive it for, or run it for 1,000 hours, and it's got to use almost the maximum amount of DEF it can to keep the numbers down, but it can get them down, and it's not violating its maximum allowed DEF injection volume, then what will happen is you'll see that at 4%. And shortly after that, it'll start logging faults for SCR inefficiency. So that 4% is in both the resettable trip and the total trip. So if you fix the problem, you do a reset, then you come back in 100 hours and look at the trip information, you'll see 4% in the total trip, but you'll see 2% down in the resettable trip. And so the resettable trip is where you want to look and use that number. And you should always clear that whenever you make repairs, so that if it does log information regarding the area that you've repaired, you get an accurate feedback from it. So that's kind of the idea with DEF usage and the DEF percentages. Now I'm going to show you a fault up here in a second, and operators, for whatever reason, they will run systems out of DEF. And when the DEF tank is at 0, it's not really at 0. And there's still DEF going into the system and it's still reducing NOx, but you have, the operator has run that engine so long with all the warnings on, warning for low, critically low, empty, check engine light, stop engine light, this thing's in full D rate, and he's just running it, and finally it'll only idle, and that's when they call somebody, and you go out there and the DEF tank is empty and the gauge reads 0. Now in machines, they'll have either an icon that comes up. Some of them have bars, 4 bars. When the tank's at 75%, there's 3 bars, 50%, 2 bars. You get the idea. In the trucks, they've got a gauge. It looks like a fuel gauge. It says E and F. And it's got a red light on it. And if it gets down to where the system starts to flag the low DEF, that red light comes on and it's bright. It catches your eye. But people will drive that truck until they're on the side of the road. Don't ask me why. I know in our fleet, the drivers all carry a couple gallons of DEF in their side compartment, because if they're out on a long run with a heavy machine that's permitted and they're using, say, quite a bit of DEF because they're making power, a lot of power all the time. Remember, power, heat, and a lot of heat and a lot of combustion pressure makes a lot of NOx. So you need a lot of DEF to neutralize that. So they'll carry extra DEF fluid. If it gets down, they'll stop and dump it in. But anyway, so let's take a look at a snapshot from an operator that ran the DEF fluid, not empty, but probably lower than he should have. So this was the fault code 3498, and I went right to the snapshot on this. There was other faults. There was operator SCR inducement because he drove faults that were related to this 3498. And the reason it drives the inducement faults, even though it's at this point, it's still very capable of and is controlling NOx, and it's within limits, but it's running out of DEF fluid. And so the system is trying to make sure it gets replenished so that it doesn't have to shut it down or go into a severe derate. And you can see we're at 6% of DEF fluid in the tank. And at 10%, actually at 14%, a lot of the warnings start. And so 6%, you're at the moderately severe level. And then when it gets down to 4%, it's going to be at the most severe level. And remember, even if this gets to 0, there's still enough DEF that the pickup tube is covered and we're sucking DEF into the DEF pump and not into the DEF unit pump and not air. So that's just the logic of it, and it's something that they have to do so that they don't have a problem with NOx coming out of the stack. So that's what I wanted to show you, that it does tell you how low the DEF was run and or what the problem was when these faults are logged. Thanks for joining me on Engine Shop Joe. See you next time.